Me, and then we introduce the speakers. Dragana, it's up to you.
Myself to be introduced. Okay, I'm a full-time professor at Political Science Faculty, University of Belgrade, Serbia. I'm actually China specialist and political economist. My area is international political economy, but also China studies and East Asia studies. I also run Center for Asian Studies at my faculty, and I'm founder and head of the Institute for Asian Studies. Well, I think that's enough for you, because at this session I'm just co-chairing. It's my pleasure to co-chair with Professor Ricceri. So I won't take any more of our precious time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dragana. Just to introduce myself, I'm Marco Ricceri. I'm the Secretary General of EURISPES, is an Italian think tank in political, economic, and social science. And inside this institute, we have a special laboratory on BRICS issues. So our vision is to understand what this type of international coordination can influence the global scenario. In the same time, this year we have a special attention to G20 coordination, because, as you know, Italy will chair the G20 during the 2001. So in name of, I see here some other experts, and I want to to say my best gratulation and thanks to Giuseppe Sacco, Hans Köchler, and Marius Evryviadis.
Marius, just plain Marius.
Marius.
Evryviadis.
Not Makarios, not Makarios.
Not Makarios, not Makarios.
Yeah.
Allora, how to proceed? We have 2 hours, and I think we can start with a contribution, and then at the end of each contribution we make a question and answer and a final debate about this very important topic.
Marco, how long for each presentation?
15 minutes.
Good, okay.
It's okay. Allora, just I want to start introducing Marius. Please present yourself as the Professor Dragana has done till now. And the point of view of Cyprus, I have to stress a particular impression when I visit Cyprus some years ago, few years ago, and Nicosia, we were shocked to see the division of this important island, and to see that between the two sides, in the center of Nicosia, there are still the walls, free zone, and so on. This is a particular aspect, a personal impression, but it gives us an idea how complex and difficult it is to manage intermediary position. Allora, Professor Marius, up
Yes.
to you.
Yes, Marco, thank you very much for introducing me. Let me say a few words about myself. I'm professor of international relations and security at Neapolis.
Sorry,
University.
Marius, we don't see your face, Marius.
Oh,
Yeah.
Because you have a window behind you.
Yeah, exactly. You need
light.
oh,
a light from front of you.
More light.
Okay, is it any better now?
No.
Slightly, but
No,
not
the light must be coming from front, not from behind.
Okay, give me 1 minute to change position. Give me 1 minute.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. He changed place with the laptop.
We have a snow here today in Belgrade.
Oh yes, in Paris as well. Yeah, yeah.
But yesterday was.
I see
yesterday
from my
was
window.
15.
The
Yesterday we had
garden
the
full
spring.
of the garden become white garden.
Yeah, but yesterday it was 15 degrees, and now it's like
Now
below
it's
zero.
below. Paris is below 1 or 2 minus.
Yes.
I am on 25 plus in
Wow.
Spain today. Today we have
Wow.
sun, spring.
Ciao Paolo. Ciao.
Buongiorno. Darwis, what a beautiful jacket you have also this year.
Oh, thank you.
I think I need your tailor one time.
But yeah, as you know that I like.
This year is very elegant, black and white, or I don't know, very nice.
Thank you.
I would want the same.
Now Marius is better.
Okay, sorry
Yes.
about this.
No, thank you very much.
Let me stabilize my computer here because it's moving.
Yeah, it's moving. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay. I am a professor of international relations and security at the Neapolis University in Paphos, which is a private university. I have been a professor prior to coming here. I was a professor in Athens at Panthéon University. My specialization is American foreign policy, American government, American foreign policy, and its impact in Europe and the Middle East. Just quickly, I should say that I have served as a diplomat with the Cypriot foreign ministry for about 15 years, from the late 1970s to the end of 1890. And I basically served during the Reagan years in Washington, and I have had some stints at the General Assembly in the UN. And I'm a columnist in the largest Cypriot newspaper, Philadelphia's. So I think I've said plenty about myself. My topic. I would also like to say that I appreciate the comments of our chairman for visiting Cyprus and visiting Nicosia. And yes, it's very depressing to see that site because basically Nicosia is the last divided Europe, the last divided capital of Europe, and things actually are really depressing here in Cyprus concerning the possibility of actually Cyprus trying to become a normal state and exist normally like most other states. And probably you will see why in this presentation that I will make, why things have come to this situation. Now, let me start by saying that if there is a single word that encapsulates the rationale behind the active participation of Cyprus in the non-aligned movement, which commenced from the beginning in 1961 and continued up to 2004, when Cyprus actually withdrew from NAM because it joined the European Union. So if there is one word that captures the rationale, that word is survival. Simply put, my thesis is that the Cypriot rationale for participating in the non-aligned movement aimed to at least counterbalance and at best neutralize efforts from the Atlantic Alliance, in particular, to emasculate Cypriot independence and even at times actually trying to eliminate Cypriot independence. And this commenced actually in 1964 and subsequently, and there are this statement of mine is documented with voluminous documentation. And this attempt continued throughout the 60s and 70s, and we had numerous efforts attempted by basically, excuse me 1 minute, please, because I need to shut off my phone. I'm sorry about this, but I'm in my office and ναι, κάνω μάθημα σε παρακαλώ μετά. I'm sorry. These efforts, by the way, to eliminate Cypriot independence did fail, but at a very high cost to Cyprus and its people. And part of the reason that this have failed has to do with a consistent and principled support and solidarity towards Cyprus exhibited by the non-aligned movement. This support materialized in international fora and in particularly in the General Assembly of the United Nations, where the non-aligned movement exerted considerable influence in the 1960s and early 70s, especially the 1960s. The political grounds that motivated the Atlantic Alliance to seek the elimination of a nation state, something, by the way, unprecedented since Hitler's elimination of Czechoslovakia, and were ideologically motivated, and they were patently focused, as I shall try to indicate. It was persistently alleged by the Atlanticists that the continuation of Cypriot independence jeopardized vital security interests of the Atlantic Alliance in the critical region of the Eastern Mediterranean and of the Middle East, and that it offered opportunities for expansionism or adventurism by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In 1964 especially, when these neo-imperialist efforts against Cyprus were reaching a climax, the non-aligned movement was extremely influential in global affairs and especially in fora like the United Nations. Cyprus utilized this support and solidarity in a systemic and effective way and successfully warded off these machinations. 10 years later, in 1974, with the waning of the Cold War and consequently of NAM during the period of detente, Cyprus found itself in a much weaker position, and in July and August 1974, she was subjected to internal subversion and to external aggression, the consequences of which are present until this day, and the example of the divided capital is prominently in display. And we have had since then almost half of Cyprus occupied by a NATO country, Turkey, and about a third of its population forced into becoming refugees in their own country. And in fact, again, we have had the first ethnic cleansing in Europe since the end of World War II. Yet, the Cypriot state, though truncated by force, survived and remains under persistent military pressure by a NATO power, Turkey, but it remains a state subject of international law and of the international system. And again, I want to reemphasize that this has a lot to do with the solidarity expressed by movements such as the non-aligned movement. Now, very quickly, and I will be very brief, Cyprus became independent in 1960 after a 4-year anti-colonial struggle, which commenced against British colonialism in 1955. In 1960, she was one of about 15 other African countries, I think, that emerged from colonialism as independent states. Preparations, and this is very significant to our subject, the non-aligned movement, preparations for the Cypriot uprising commenced in 1954. And significantly, 1954 and 1955 were the years when the non-aligned movement started coming into being. In 1954, as we all know, in Colombo, Ceylon, Sri Lanka today, and there was a meeting by Sri Lanka, Burma, Myanmar today, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan, what came to be known as the Colombo Five, who met there and endorsed a proposal by Indonesia for a larger gathering of Afro-Asian countries to address wider issues, both regional and global. The now famous 1955 Afro-Asian Conference in Indonesia, commonly known as the Bandung Conference, followed exactly a year later in 1955. Again, also, the years 1954 and 1955 were critical for world peace. In 1954, we had the Geneva Conference that was called to address and settle issues resulting from the first bloody regional Cold War conflict in the Korean Peninsula, and equally important for our purposes, to address the dismantling of the French Indochina Empire after the disastrous defeat of the French in Vietnam. The 1954 Geneva Conference coincided to the month with the Bandung Conference of 1955. But in 1955, there was another meeting in Geneva, the Geneva Summit, called to address issues of world peace amongst the great powers, the big four powers of World War II, or the so-called four policemen. The calling of the Colombo Conference and its coincidence to the month with the Geneva Conference was undoubtedly influenced by developments in the First Indochina War and the prospects for peace. Regional countries, and especially Indonesia and India, were keen to have a say in such developments that impacted them and the region, and they did not want to be merely bystanders. The non-aligned movement would offer them and others the instrumentality to do so. The 1955 Geneva Summit, which followed the Bandung one by a few months, must have also acted as a catalyst for the eventual instrumentalization of the germinating non-aligned movement. The stated mission of the Geneva Summit was to reduce international tensions by addressing parallel roads to global peace and security, such as nuclear issues, disarmament, trade barriers, etc. But it did not escape the non-great powers, namely the rest of the world, that the Geneva Summit bore all the characteristics of the Cold War, and nay, even of Yalta, of a new Yalta, with the great powers policing the world in accordance with their own national interests and ideological ones. There was hardly any light with regards to the role of the rest of the world, and that such summits were in fact prelude of things to come. In the post-World War II bipolar system. So, because countries were not willing to align with either blocs, the rationale for the non-aligned movement was there. It became imperative for a third way, and for Cyprus, it was not just imperative, as I indicated, it was a matter of survival. The way Cyprus emerged as an independent country is again unique and unprecedented in the annals of colonization. Unlike all other colonies, Cyprus was denied the sacred right of self-determination enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Its independence and sovereignty were severely limited, and the retention of British military bases on its territory were made a sine qua non for the termination of British colonial occupation. In short, the 1959-60 agreements that marked Cypriot independence were negotiated by outside powers, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Greece, and were specifically designed to safeguard their own interests in the context of Atlantic and Cold War security. The Cypriots had no say whatsoever in the constitutional arrangements with which they had to live in perpetuity. And through a complex trilateral legal arrangement that was contrary to the provisions of the UN Charter, they were placed under the political and military tutelage, there is no other word, of the aforementioned three countries. Though nominally independent, the Republic of Cyprus had to accept the stationing of foreign troops on its territory, ostensibly for the protection of its territorial integrity and independence, which did not turn out to be the case. It had to accept a number of military bases and other facilities that were controlled by Britain and were managed together with the cooperation of the United States. And the Cypriot bases, I must tell you, my friends, were also nuclear bases. There were nuclear weapons in Cyprus in the late 50s, and these weapons were targeting the Soviet Union through the use of British V bombers. So it was the prospect of preventing such a development, and worse, preempting the actual physical division of Cyprus between the UK, Turkey, and Greece, that the political leader of the Cypriot anti-colonial struggle, Archbishop Makarios, sought the support of the emerging non-aligned movement. Decolonization featured prominently in the agenda of the Bandung Conference, and Makarios attended the conference as an observer to seek support for Cypriot guerrilla war against the British and to argue the case for Cypriot self-determination. It is argued by some that initiatives by countries like India in the General Assembly of the United Nations in the early 50s and in the mid 50s may have had some effect in preventing the actual division of Cyprus and opening the way for its independence. Be that as it may, the collapsing positions of the West in the Middle East, extremely important in the 50s, what was happening in the Middle East. And basically what was happening was the gradual collapsing of the Western system. And I mention here the Suez fiasco of 1956 and the 1958 Baghdad coup, through which the Baghdad alliance collapsed. So by 1958-59, which were the years where a solution of Cyprus was being sought, we had the collapse of the Western security and political position in the Middle East. And part of the challenge, by the way, was coming from Arab socialism and Arab nationalism, personified by the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. However, the presence of Makarios at Bandung was not in vain. The solution of Cyprus did come about the way I described to you. In other words, Makarios could do nothing at the time, but the important thing is that by being at Bandung, Makarios was able to meet and establish friendships with important future NAM leaders like Nasser that I have mentioned, like Nehru, like Suharto, and establish serious bonds with them, and especially.
Sorry, interrupt you. Not Suharto, Sukarno.
I'm sorry.
Suharto is the one who takes over.
Yes. I know, and I know the history very well, my friend. Yeah, I know what happened. I know what happened under his regime, and terrible things, terrible things happened under his regime. I'm very well aware.
Yeah. Professor Marius, pay attention to time.
Okay. Let me very quickly tell you that Cyprus did join after independence, the founding meeting in Belgrade in 1961, and became an active member in the movement. Cyprus was held in very high respect because of its anti-colonial movement in both Africa and Asia, and was able to be very influential during the 60s in the movement. By the way, let me just say something extremely important now, and I'll try to conclude in a few minutes. Cyprus, by being non-aligned, was not anti-West, and the accusation, as I told you, of Cyprus being anti-West was focused and ideologically motivated. And the best documentation I have about this is that in 1962, Cyprus, Makarios would visit the United States. He would be greeted by President Kennedy as an important third world leader, and he was praised for his non-aligned movement, because both the Americans thought that a country like Cyprus could play a very important moderating role in the movement. So the accusation that Cyprus was actually anti-Western, and that eventually it would become a Cuba in the Mediterranean, was totally unfounded. The 1964 crisis followed up the Cuban crisis. And let me tell you something, again, very important. Before the Cuban crisis, before 1964, Cyprus was called, and please remember this, was called a potential Czechoslovakia in the post-World War II system. Why? Because Czechoslovakia went communist through some sort of representation through the some arrangements that were considered democratic. And the accusation against Cyprus was that because it also had a relatively large communist party, was that eventually this party will take over Cyprus and turn it over to the Soviet Union. Now, when the Cuban crisis occurred, Cyprus was named in a very sexy way as the Cuba of the Mediterranean, and the Archbishop as the Castro of the Mediterranean. And this accusation stood and worked against the Cypriot interest. Actually, I did meet the American military intelligence guide, a guy called Thomas Adams. I met him in Washington when he retired, and he proudly told me that I was the one that named Magarios Castro and Cyprus Cuba. At any rate, very quickly in 1964, the first attempt was made to eliminate Cypriot independence. It happened in the London Conference, and the bottom line of this conference was that Cypriot independence should be terminated, and a tridominium established over Cyprus, policed by NATO troops. The tridominium would be Greece, England, Turkey, and Greece. Cyprus vehemently opposed this and managed to neutralize by going to the Security Council and obtaining a very important Security Council resolution that condemned these machinations and established peacekeeping force in Cyprus and a mediator to present proposals for a solution. Also, and this is important, in 1964 in October, the second non-aligned meeting occurred in Cairo, and it produced a very, very important resolution in support of Cyprus, and the document of the non-aligned movement was circulated within the United Nations as a General Assembly document. Very quickly, as I mentioned in the beginning, as we proceeded in the period of detente in the late 60s and early 70s, the rationale for the existence of the non-aligned movement started weakening. And when in 1964 we had the Greek-produced coup d'etat and the Turkish invasion, Cyprus was in a much weaker position to defend itself, although it managed to retain its independence, now in the manner that we all know today, in a divided state and in a divided capital. Let me conclude by saying that the non-aligned movement was extremely important in the foreign policy of Cyprus. It is my opinion that it helped ward off the early machinations in the early 60s. And although the non-aligned movement today has lost its rationale in the sense that the Cold War ended, it still remains a very important movement because it retains the high moral ground in a number of issues, including the end of colonialism, the end of racialism and discrimination, and it also helps through its presence in various fora, and especially the United Nations, issues that affect third world countries and issues like the ones we are facing today. I'm sorry for taking perhaps more time than I should. It's a very long story. It's a very complicated story, but in another way, it's a very simple story. It's the struggle of a young country coming out of colonialism to defend itself against machinations of the West that were based on bogus arguments and bogus ideological positions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Professor Marius. Dragana, have you some question, comment at the moment? And then we can accumulate the question for the final discussion.
Yes, maybe that way we should proceed.
Oh,
yeah, thank you.
Okay. No, I have a lot of questions about the situation of Cyprus of today, the scandal that is still divided and the tension in Mediterranean area, but we will discuss later. So the second speaker is Professor Giuseppe Sacco from Italy.
Okay.
It's an economist and a member of our BRICS lab of EURISPES. Professor Sacco?
Here I am. You see me?
Okay.
No.
Allora,
No, this is only
20 minutes, Sacco.
Okay.
Respect the time.
I don't see why I shouldn't. Okay. It is
Present yourself, Sacco.
Okay, I am a professor of international economic relations. I'm basically a professor of international relations with a twist in economics, which is due to the fact that I devote great attention to the third world and to development problems, which also are the problems of the southern part of Italy I come from. Okay, so basically I'm a professor of international affairs. I've been teaching to the University of Florence. I taught 29 years at the University of Rome, 12 years at the University of Paris at Sciences Po, and then in a number of other places in the world, such as Sogang University in Seoul, or what else? At the University of San Francisco in California, University of San Francisco, California, which is not University of California, San Francisco, is a private institution, and what else? I also taught at Fudan University in China, etc. I also have been for a while, for several years, at the OECD, which was not a great experience, and was not fairly uninteresting. And then I have worked as a consultant in 64 different countries. Well, okay, that's about me. That's about all. What I'm supposed to talk about is the relationship between Italy and the non-aligned movement. Of course, Italy as a country defeated the country in World War II, and given also its strategic position in Europe, didn't have much choice after World War II in being part of the Western Bloc, because, as you know, as once Stalin had said to Milo and Chilas, whoever occupies with his military force a territory imposes the social regime in those territories. In any case, the Italians were eager of having a democratic system after 20 years of fascism, and there is no doubt that the Italians welcomed the type of regime that was created after World War II. Now, of course, the Italians welcomed the democratic regime, but the free elections were seen as a way of expressing also opinions that had become very strong under fascism. And in the last 2 years of the war, when Italian guerrillas, Italian partisans fought against the Germans and the fascists, So that in 1946, after the end of the war, in 1946 we had a referendum, and the election of a constituent assembly. This was not a parliament, in the sense that the government didn't need to be voted for the Constitutional Assembly. The purpose of the Constitutional Assembly was to write down a democratic constitution for Italy. So it was not a parliament. The same day, on June 2nd, 1946, a referendum was held, and by a rather wide margin, the Italians voted to kick out the king and create the Republic of Italy. This was the second major effort at creating a republic, and this time we succeeded, and the king of Italy found refuge in Egypt under the Egyptian king Farouk. This is 1946. In this election of 1946, the left was largely, was very strong. There was a very strong Communist Party and a very strong Socialist Party. On the other side, there was also, on the right, the Party of the Common People, which basically was voted for by people who had been involved with the fascist regime and the previous and the monarchics, of course. This is about peninsular Italy, because Sicily was a slightly different story that we don't have the time here to tell. But basically, the important thing was that from the Iron Wall went down from Stettin to Trieste and down the Adriatic. On the other side of the Adriatic, there was Yugoslavia, that at the time was, of course, the most the ally ruled by the ally that Stalin probably liked most. This was Marshal Tito. Okay, in any case, there was no doubt that Italy had to be in the Western Bloc, and was military also ended up in 1947 in being part of NATO. Now, the problem was that at a certain moment around 1948, the Communist Party in Italy had about 2 million registered members. Italy at the time was a little over 50 million people, which means that next to a little less than 4% of the Italian population had the card of the Communist Party. We're not just sympathetic of the Communist Party, had the card of the Communist Party, 4% of the population. And this, one has to understand, made it in a way the country with the strongest Communist Party in the world, because being a communist in Soviet Union or later in China gave you a certain amount of, if not privilege, they gave you plenty of privilege, but at least you were seen favorably by your government. In Italy, you were seen very favorably by your government. A young man who was even rumored to be sympathetic to the Communist Party, when he was drafted into the army, could not be an officer, had to be a private soldier, because given the situation, it was logical that the army didn't want to have people among the ranks of his officers, to have people who were sympathetic to the theoretical enemy. So if you think that you only had disadvantages in being a communist in Italy, this proportion is enormous. It's enormous. This made basically that while Germany was divided physically in two parts. Italy was divided psychologically and politically in two parts. Every side tried to organize itself as a kind of separate society. Moreover, what was obvious was that should the Communist Party win the election, which were held in 1948 after the Constitution was written down by the Constituent Assembly that had been nominated in 1946, elected in 1946. There were elections in 1948. And the communists were probably had good chances of winning that election. This was clearly impossible, because should the Communist Party win the election, or the communists and in alliance with the socialists win the election, there would be the Americans and the English mostly would organize a coup d'etat to prevent such a government to rule Italy. So what the communist reaction was, probably under Stalin's suggestion, was to try to lose the election, but conquer as much power as possible inside the society. So the communists convinced the socialists to run together with common candidates. And this created two things. One thing is that from the Socialist Party, there was a splinter group. There was a secessions from the Communist and Socialist Party. A group of socialists created the Socialist Party of Labor that stood out of the alliance. And the second was that as the vote was for the party, and then you had to select the candidates, among the candidates, the communists were organized in such a way that in the common lists where communist and socialist candidates were presented, the communists took over. Basically, the communists managed to lose the election, but to marginalize the Socialist Party. This was 1948. This was the maximum of tension between the left and right. The tension of the Cold War was inside the country. The communists, however, were in a strong position in the Constitutional Assembly that had been elected in 1946, and managed to introduce a certain number of things that they knew would favor them in the future. One was to create a totally independent body of judges that had no relations whatsoever with the Ministry of Justice. The judges in Italy have a kind of separate body with their own elections. They have a governing body. They train and select new judges, which means that they work through co-optation. And Togliatti, when he arrived from Russia, Togliatti was the secretary of the Communist Party of the abroad, because there was also a Communist Party inside, took good care to, I have no more time, you mean? I have some time?
You have, please control your time, because you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
To conclude.
Basically, they managed to conquer they selected the judges who had been fascist and kept inside those who opted for being communists after World War II. Basically, they created a kind of a body inside the state. The other thing was that they transformed basically Italy in a kind of federal state, knowing that at least in 3 important regions, the communists would be in a majority. Okay, this was the situation in 1948. 1948 was the maximum tension. Then the thing eased a little bit. First of all, because Yugoslavia broke away from the Soviet royalty, let's say, and became in a way strategically more and politically more interesting than Italy. Also in the election of 53, of course, in the election of 48, as the communists and socialists were making a bloc, the right made a bloc and won in 1948. In 1943, however, 53, the socialists and the communists ran separately, and so did the Christian Democrats and the extreme right. So the road was open to a convergence of the center between socialists and Christian Democrats. This was the idea that made a semi-neutral Italy possible. In 1953, also, a man by the name of Enrico Mattei became president of the National Oil Company, ENI, and he immediately got in touch with Nasser, who had just arrived to power in Egypt, and started a cooperation, a very intense cooperation with Nasser, that on July 25, 1956, gave the occasion to a meeting in Egypt between Mattei and Nasser, where Mattei guaranteed the support to Egypt, the Italian support to Egypt in its foreign policy. The next day, Nasser nationalized the canal. You have to understand that Mattei had become, in a way, the real master of Italian foreign policy. Was so powerful that actually was the leader of the Italian foreign policy. The problem of energy is crucial for Italy because it's a country, an industrial country without energy, not coal, no oil. Okay, Mattei was, of course, back in December 1956 in Egypt, and the cooperation was even more intense. Mattei did a number of other things. For instance, made an agreement with Iran. This post-1953 Iran, where the Shah was back, but he broke a rule of the oil cartel that established that oil production was split 50-50 between the company, the exploiting company, and the country. And Mattei accepted instead a breakdown where Iran got 75% and Italy 25%, and the company 25%. And then he established a good relation with Tunisia, with a number of non-allied countries. All this, to make a long story short, culminated after the election, after Kennedy's election in America. Kennedy was convinced of that he had an idea that either the colonial countries stopped, the colonial powers stopped trying to keep the so-called third world under, or these countries would go communist. So it was in favor of favoring the independence, the real independence of ex-colonial countries, in order to prevent them from seduced by communism. And in 1961, Kennedy went so far as to suggest to the Italian Prime Minister Fanfani to give more space to Mattei's action. And the end of the story was that in November 62, in October 62, Mattei was assassinated, and in November 63, Kennedy was assassinated. who assassinated Kennedy is unclear, but who assassinated Mattei is very clear. This was the OAS, the French anti-independence, anti-free Algeria movement. The story didn't stop there, however, because in the mid-70s, a different strategy for making Italy less strictly aligned on American position was started by the young secretary of the Socialist Party, and he went further than just economic policy and oil. He went as far as asserting in parliament that the Palestinian people had the right to the armed struggle. This was considered kind of a position, dangerous position, by somebody. The peak of this situation was in 1985, when a group of 5 members of the People's Organization for the Liberation of Palestine kidnapped a tourist boat in the Mediterranean, an Italian boat, the Achille Lauro. They had registered as passengers, and their idea was to create an accident by maybe exploding the boat in Latakia, in the Syrian harbor of Latakia. What happened was that they were discovered, and the ship was pushed to go, thanks to very good relations that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andreotti, had with Assad, the father. They were denied access to Latakia and were pushed towards Egypt, where an agreement was made, thanks to our Egyptian friends, that the ship would be liberated, that the 4 kidnappers would be put in a plane and shipped to Tunis, where the Palestine Liberation Organization had its basis. What happened was that at night, American military planes forced the Egyptian plane to land in Sicily. They landed on the strip of a NATO basis, but this NATO basis was not controlling the airstrip, because the airstrip was in common between an Italian and the NATO military bases. So the plane was besieged by the Italian Air Force. Then a group of American Marines, the SEALs, landed illegally in Sicily and encircled the Italian military. At that point, the Prime Minister Craxi mobilized the police that encircled the Americans, that encircled the Italians, that encircled the Egyptian plane. The Egyptian plane on the other side answered that they would fire if somebody. There was a night where practically Italy and the US were on the brink of war. It's a long story.
Professor Sacco, time, please. Go to conclusion.
Okay, I can stop there if you want. Let me mention there are 2 other questions, and then we can discuss it if you want.
Please, time. Please.
Time. Okay. There was also an attempt of the Communist Party to become a Euro-Communist Party and find a middle way with an alliance with the Christian Democrats, the so-called historic compromise, and this culminated in a new government that was sworn in 1980. In any case, the day 3 days before the new government, supported by the communists, was to be approved by the parliament. It was approved. A terrorist group kidnapped the leader of the communists, of the Christian Democrats, and killed him after 55 days of. In any case, basically all attempts of moving Italy into a position of neutrality, let's say, or something similar to neutrality, ended up tragically. The final effort was in the 80s, was in the 2000s, when Italy was the major country that cooperated more than any other Western country with Libya. And Gaddafi went as far as declaring journalists that I'd ask why you prefer Italy to any other country, and he answered, because the Italians are the only European country who has no colonial nostalgia. Okay, Gaddafi, as everybody knows, was killed, I think, in May 1911, if I'm not right, if I'm not wrong, and by a coup organized by the French, as you know, because of Sarkozy organized the thing that led to Gaddafi's killing. And 1 month later, the Italian prime minister was forced by a plot organized by Germans and the French to withdraw Berlusconi. So the two leaders of this thing, and the one killed and the other one obliged, in spite of being in majority in parliament, to give his position to a technical prime minister who had strong links with Germany.
Thank you very much, Professor Sacco. Very, very interesting and stimulating. Now we have Professor Hans Köchler.
There are no questions.
Later, because time. I sign from my side. I sign a lot of questions, and I think Dragana has 2 other questions and all the other participants. But now we have to respect time. Professor Köchler.
Thank you. I will speak about Austria and the non-aligned movement. Let me begin with stating the obvious. Austria's position vis-à-vis the non-aligned movement has substantially changed with the transformation of the global order from bipolarity after the Second World War to a system that is characterized by Western-dominated globalization. For some years now, this has been an order of United States hegemony, which may be gradually phased out into the direction of a new multipolar constellation. Anyway, the outcome is still open. Developments could also go into the direction of a new bipolar constellation. I will try to be brief because we are already late in our program. So I only give the main points. As of today, the position of Austria vis-à-vis the non-aligned movement could frankly be described as a kind of non-relationship. This wasn't not always so. Decades ago, Austria's attitudes vis-à-vis NAM was constructive, and one could even say cooperative to some extent. And there is an important historical fact that will explain this. The emergence of Austria as a sovereign and independent state after the Second World War was closely linked to a commitment to a non-aligned, that means neutral, foreign policy. Let's just recall, in 1945, Austria was occupied and divided into 4 occupation zones of the Allied powers: United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and France. It was only the commitment of our Austrian negotiators in Moscow in April 1955 that the way was opened towards withdrawal of the foreign military troops from Austrian soil. At this meeting in Moscow, which was concluded with what we call in Austria the Moscow Memorandum or Moscow Declaration, the Austrian governmental leaders stated that Austria will adopt strict military neutrality according to the Swiss model as soon as all foreign troops have evacuated Austrian soil. And that paved the ground for the conclusion of the States Treaty 1 month later between Austria and the 4 allied powers, in which those powers committed themselves to withdraw by the 25th of October the same year, I mean 55. And exactly 1 day later, in 56, the Austrian parliament convened and enacted a constitutional law that provided for the status of permanent neutrality in the sense of military neutrality. So that also is very important to understand the Austrian position, that neutrality in Austria's understanding never meant ideological neutrality. The country always saw itself as part of the Western world. But as a permanently neutral state, Austria aspired to be a kind of mediator and facilitator of dialogue between the blocs. On the basis of this understanding, Austria joined the United Nations towards the end of that same year I mentioned before, namely 1955. Not surprisingly, I would say, Austria's neutrality was most productive, so to speak, during the Cold War. Vienna hosted 2 of the great superpower summits in that era, namely in 1961, between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and again in 1979 between Carter and Brezhnev. That meeting was concluded with the agreement on SALT II, the so-called Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union. Also, along these lines, Austria offered to host international organizations in Vienna, and that offer was met with a rather positive response by many international organizations, just to mention the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, also the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, I mean its preparatory commission, OPEC, or also more recently the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In that regard, in the 1970s, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who was Austrian, in cooperation with the Foreign Minister and then Prime Minister of Austria, Bruno Kreisky, played an important role. Austria also began, after its admission to the United Nations, to contribute troops and civilian personnel to United Nations peacekeeping and monitoring missions. One could mention here missions, for instance, in Syria and in Cyprus. So far, since 1960, when this cooperation with the United Nations began, Austria has deployed more than 90,000 soldiers and civilian personnel in more than 100 United Nations missions. The most positive and constructive attitude vis-à-vis the non-aligned movement, if I may get to the main topic, the most positive attitude dates to the era of Chancellor, that means Prime Minister, Bruno Kreisky. That was from 1970 to 1983. One could refer here to Kreisky's cooperation with some of the great leaders and even founders of the non-aligned movement, such as Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, or also later Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India. The cooperation of Austria at that time with NAM related in particular to issues of North-South dialogue. One of the most important activities at this time, although it was not followed by the desired success, was the summit conference which Prime Minister Kreisky hosted together or convened together with the President of Mexico, López Portillo, in Cancun in 1981. In that meeting, the issue of a new international economic order was raised, and that was emphasized in particular by the attending Prime Minister of China. Numerous initiatives were launched by Chancellor Kreisky at that time regarding another issue that was of top importance for the non-aligned movement, namely Palestine and the dialogue between Israel and the Arab world. Kreisky convened that by now historical summit meeting in Vienna with Yasser Arafat, to which he also succeeded to invite and to have as a participant the Chancellor, means Prime Minister of Germany, Willy Brandt. And that meeting was instrumental for the recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the Western world, because up to that meeting, the recognition related to the what at that time was called countries of the Third World, and to member states of the non-aligned movement in particular. In this period, this was the period, if I may just add pro domo, so to speak, when our organization, the International Progress Organization, which is based in Vienna, did organize several international gatherings on issues that were of special concern to the non-aligned countries. And we did so in close cooperation with some of the leading countries of the movement at the time, namely Yugoslavia and India in particular. And all these meetings were supported and facilitated to a certain extent by the Austrian authorities because of the interest Prime Minister Kreisky did show in these issues. Just to mention very briefly, an international meeting of experts in Vienna on the new international economic order, which we organized in 1979. That means 2 years before the Cancun Summit. At that meeting, our keynote speaker in Vienna was the Minister of Finance of Austria. I also would like to mention another meeting of experts, which we held in Nicosia, Cyprus, on the new international information and communication order, or an international conference on the question of Palestine in Vienna in 1980, which was inaugurated at the instructions of Prime Minister Kreisky by the Foreign Minister of Austria. More close cooperation with the non-aligned movement we did have in the preparations for a meeting, for an international meeting of experts in Baghdad in May 1982. Baghdad was chosen because initially it was supposed to be the venue of the summit conference, of the 82 summit conference of the non-aligned movement. Because of the circumstances, because of the war, the summit had to be shifted to India. Thank you for displaying, Professor Kudori, the book about this meeting. And in that particular conference, we closely cooperated with Leo Mattes, who had served as the chief of cabinet of President Tito exactly in the year when the non-aligned movement was founded in 1961. He was the chief organizer, in my understanding, of that summit meeting, and he was a close personal friend, and he did advise us in the preparation of the Baghdad meeting. And he was also elected in our conference in Baghdad as a general rapporteur of the conference. In 1983, if I may proceed now to other activities of Austria, of the Austrian government and the Austrian Prime Minister, in '83, Bruno Kreisky made it possible that the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, came to Austria to inaugurate an international conference on dialogue between India and Europe. And she made the effort to attend this meeting in a tiny village in the Tyrolean mountains in the west of Austria, which was quite, I mean, it's not so easy to reach that place from India, but it just showed the close relationship the Indian Prime Minister had with Austria and with the Austrian Prime Minister. Without this relationship, it would have been impossible for the organizers to secure the participation or to secure the participation of the Prime Minister of India as the inaugural speaker. The policy of what the government at this time in the 70s and 80s called active neutrality, this policy came to an end when the geopolitical circumstances changed. A lot, by the way, I think also changed in the course of these developments for the non-aligned movement itself. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact, Austria put the focus of its foreign policy on integration into the then European Economic Community, later the European Union. The country joined the European Union on the 1st of January 1995, and soon after, 1 month later, Austria also joined the PFP, Partnership for Peace of NATO. And more and more also politicians began to speak that Austria would not strictly understand its neutrality according to the Swiss model anymore. That obviously meant an erosion of the entire concept of neutrality, one of the founding notions of the Second Republic of Austria. I would say it made neutrality as a constitutional concept almost meaningless. The lawmakers and the government in the 90s well understood the problems, and for that reason, they made the unique step to change the Constitution of Austria and to add a particular article that now allows Austria even to join the so-called EU battle groups in deployments that are described as deployments of crisis management. We know that term also from NATO terminology, where they speak of so-called crisis response operations. And it was at this time, as I already said, that Austria's neutrality was increasingly challenged by public statements. Even I do recall that was the case in a statement by the then Prime Minister of Austria in the 1990s, I mean, and also early on in this century. This erosion of Austria's commitment to neutrality, by the way, became most obvious during the 1999 Kosovo War of NATO. In this time, there were in total 33 cases of overflights of NATO fighter planes over Austrian airspace. Austria did not deploy its own jets just to make sure in the air, interceptor jets as we call them, to make sure that this cannot be tolerated. No Austrian plane ever took off. The only thing that happened was that Austria issued the usual diplomatic statements and diplomatic protests. So that was certainly not an active understanding of neutrality and not an understanding of neutrality in the sense of comprehensive self-defense as the Constitution provided. It was a kind of acceptance of the maybe status quo or realpolitik, an acceptance of the new power constellation. So if I may conclude very briefly, currently, Austria's relationship with the non-aligned movement, I think that's obvious from what I said, is mainly of historical importance. The actual relationship is rather formal, or one could say even ceremonial, as you know, together with other neutral European countries and even some NATO members, such as the United States and the United Kingdom. Austria is listed by the non-aligned movement as a so-called guest country, not as an observer country. In this guest capacity, Austria is invited on an ad hoc basis to the opening and closing ceremonies of non-aligned summits and ministerial conferences, and that's it, nothing more. Austria's foreign and defense policies are clearly oriented, as I say, towards the European Union and to a certain extent also to the United States and NATO. Also, in recent years, Austria did not adopt a clear position regarding neoliberal globalization. This has meant a constant erosion of our policy of neutrality in what I would call in favor of Western-centered realpolitik. It is worthy of note, however, if I may conclude with that, that the majority of Austrians themselves, unlike the governing elite, still adhere to a more traditional or classical understanding of neutrality in the sense of strict non-alignment. Neutrality is still very popular in Austria. Austrians consider a non-aligned foreign policy as indispensable for preserving the country's independence. In spite of the obvious paradigm change in Austria's foreign policy since the Cold War era, the country's continued commitment to multilateralism, which, by the way, was also obvious in our hosting of the Iran nuclear negotiations that were concluded in Vienna. So in spite of this paradigm change, our continued commitment to multilateralism and Austria's active participation also in the movement against nuclear arms. Austria was one of the leading countries behind the adoption of the recent treaty on the illegality of nuclear arms. So these initiatives or these commitments could open the way, in my assessment, for constructive cooperation, albeit limited in scope, with countries of the non-aligned movement. Another question will be, however, and that's my final caveat, up to what extent the non-aligned countries themselves are still committed to the Bandung principles. And with that, I conclude my presentation. I hope I was not over time.
Great question you pose, Professor Köchler. Allora, I ask Dragana to support for collect all the questions. I think we have to organize the collection of questions and comments and then to give the speaker the possibility to answer. I have 3 questions from my side I put on the table, and then we collect the others. First question for the speakers. The non-aligned movement, how face with the scandal of the divided Cyprus? Because it's still the only example we have of a divided country. Second question, Cyprus and the tensions, the new tension in Mediterranean area. Around Cyprus, there are gas and oil and a lot of new tension. What is the position of the non-aligned movement to support the reduction of such tension? Third, what is the aligned movement and the Mediterranean issues? What is the role? Because they play, some of them, they play a very important role. The new player like India, China, Russia, Brazil in the Mediterranean area. What is the general position? And then putting together what Professor Köchler and Sacco said, we see that the country like Italy or Austria pay a lot in terms also in very terrible things, pay a lot the possibility to join aligned movement. So Dragana, up to you.
Yes, I also wanted to add and ask, what about presentation of Professor Dervesky, who sent us his paper? Should I read some of it or not? Or what do you suggest?
Later at the end,
Okay.
before the discussion.
Okay. All right. I think due to the time limit, we should maybe now limit ourselves to these questions and try to get answers to them, and then maybe we'll go deeper into discussion if you agree.
Okay, okay. Are any questions for the speakers from other participants? I see many participants. Kudori.
Yes. It is my turn or not? Or later? No?
You can ask questions.
Go on, soon.
Yeah. First, I would like to greet Professor Köchler and thank you for his book, this one, because he sent me his book, The Principle of Non-Alignment. So this is the book I have from Professor Köchler. So my question is related to other countries of Europe and also Cyprus. Yeah, Cyprus is a part of Europe now. Related to the statement of Professor Köchler that the people, not the elite, the people of Austria is in favor of non-alignment as a foreign policy. So what happened? What is the people aspiration in Italy and Cyprus, if it is they have a similar attitude like the Austrian people? And what about other neutral on countries in Europe like Switzerland? And Sweden before was also neutral, I think. So if you have any information on any comments, if there is a kind of a common, how do you say, common sense or common opinion or common trend among the people of neutral countries like Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Italy, etc., related to this bipolar word, which was, of course, East-West, and now with the new kind of Cold War between US and China. So that is for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I something?
Aspetta, if there are, let's control if there are other questions. I see Paolo Motta and other, Di Giulia, Follet, and so on.
But nobody raised hand, no sent a chat message or something. So
okay, let's go to the answer with a particular attention to the future prospects of the role of NAM and what Italy and France and Austria can do in this direction.
please put your microphone. Okay.
Professor Marius, then Sacco, then Köchler. Professor Mario?
Hey, disappeared.
Yeah, maybe we should just proceed with Professor Sacco.
Yes. Okay, Professor Sacco.
Well, I don't think I have asked to speak, but if as I am there, I just want to make stress a difference. The type of neutrality that and neutralism are two different things. The Swedish example doesn't fit at all with what we have been, because as you know, Sweden was neutral during World War II, but it allowed German troops to move from occupy Norway and Finland, that was an ally of Germany, and established themselves, German troops, permanently in the north of Sweden. So this was Swedish neutrality during World War II. After the end of World War II, at NATO times, it was theoretically neutral. Sweden was neutral, and it was actually neutral, but entered NATO only once that the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Soviet menace had disappeared. And now it is a NATO country. This shows enough of what they think and what meaning they give to the word of neutrality. The neutralism is a different thing. It's an active position. It's an active position of countries that had been colonized by Western powers to get rid of this domination without automatically falling into the hands of the enemy hegemonic power that was the Soviet Union at the time. And this was a permanent problem. If you think that, just to come to today's events, that Mr. Aung San, the father of Miss San Suu Kyi, had founded the Communist Party in 1938 in Burma, the Communist Party to fight against colonialism. In 1941, he was leading a Burmese army allied with Japanese, because the Japanese were saying that Asia should go to the Asians, and was decorated several times by the Emperor of Japan himself. When he came, when at the end of the war, well, it didn't live very long, because Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India, at the moment of the split of India into parts, in several parts, got him assassinated. And this kind of dilemma was quite obvious. The point of fighting great powers without falling into the hands of the enemies of these great powers that had colonized Asia and Africa. This is completely different. And in a way, also with Austria's neutrality, is something different. Austria's neutrality. I don't say it simply because the Swedish example is unique, but there should be no confusion between neutrality and neutralism.
Thank you very much. Very important, this passage. Professor Köchler, allora, before to answer, there is a question by Herr Supana.
Yes.
Herr Supana, put your question.
It's written, we can read it.
I can see it in writing also.
Yes, yes, Professor saw it.
I can, shall I respond now?
Please do.
Herr Supana asked.
Yeah,
Because,
Professor
it's
read.
written here, we can see it as text.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there was also initially a question from Professor Kudori about the position of the people and the citizens in Europe, in particular in the neutral countries in Europe, Switzerland, Austria, Sweden. What is important to emphasize is that the day when the Austrian parliament adopted the neutrality law, the law of permanent neutrality in the sense of armed neutrality, namely the 26th of October, since that time is the national holiday of the Republic of Austria. So this is really inscribed into the political memory of Austria forever, so to speak, and it indicates the top priority, a position that does not take sides on military disputes of other countries, how important that is for Austria. And because the idea that helped us to solve the problem, in particular with the Allied powers and with the Soviet Union in '55, the idea that helped us solve it was to emphasize neutrality according to the Swiss model, because Switzerland had a longer experience with neutrality. It was a kind of generally supported tradition in Austria that every prime minister immediately after he took office made his first official visit to Switzerland. The idea was to symbolize, to make visible to the international community the importance Austria gave to such a policy of neutrality. But unfortunately, because of the developments I described in my presentation, in those years after the admission of Austria to the European Union, this tradition faded out. And now the person who is prime minister now did not follow that tradition. So they have other priorities. And the big problem now for neutrality in a credible sense in Europe is, and Switzerland differs in that regard, and rightly so, the big problem is how to reconcile our commitments in our constitution to be neutral in armed conflicts, in armed confrontations, when at the same time we have changed our constitution and so that we do participate, so Austria does participate in European military activities. Of course, it's always under the umbrella of peace enforcement measures, but it means also not just monitoring, and as we did when we sent our troops to United Nations peacekeeping missions. This also relates to active combat in law. And in my view, there is a contradiction, conceptual contradiction now in our constitution, because this kind of provision is simply not compatible with military neutrality. But as I said, the government made it a kind of founding story in Austria, or kind of part of our founding history, to endorse neutrality. So overall, there is a kind, still with few exceptions, a kind of lip service, but to that principle. But the politics takes, so to speak, takes another course. As far as the question from Herr Sumbana is concerned, yeah, I would say, as far as conflicts in the Middle East, and in particular this intractable conflict over Palestine is concerned, in my understanding, a strict policy of neutrality still makes sense, particularly for smaller countries such as Austria and Switzerland. For instance, and we have seen it also what it means in case of peace efforts and peace negotiations. A neutral country is a more natural host, so to speak, of the most difficult negotiations. So for instance, some of these difficult negotiations between Iran and the great powers plus Germany, and the final negotiations took place in Vienna, and they did not take place in a country that was not neutral. Many of these negotiations also traditionally take place in Switzerland. Even up to a certain extent, there was a kind of competition always between Switzerland and Austria in that regard. And I could also recall one other important fact that underlines the importance or the relevance of neutrality vis-à-vis conflicts in the Middle East. When the United Nations General Assembly could not meet in New York City on the question of Palestine, because the United States, that is a party to the Middle East conflict, prevented the president of Palestine or the chairman of the PLO to attend the conference. The conference was held in Geneva, at a place where there was no interference of the government into the conduct of affairs of the United Nations. Certainly at that time, this was also a violation of the agreements between the United States, headquarters agreement between the United States and the United Nations. But anyway, a superpower has its acts quite often also in neglect of the law. And in such cases, a neutral country really can play a helpful role. You also ask about the future of the non-aligned movement and what all of this means for the future. I would say now the difficulty for the non-aligned movement was in recent years is related to the change of the geopolitical constellation, because suddenly there was a kind of unipolar environment. There was not anymore a bipolar power struggle or rivalry where it would have made sense to say, or where one have had the real freedom to say we remain independent and neutral vis-à-vis these two great blocs. When there is only one power center, when there is only one hegemon, the problem is for many of the smaller and medium-sized countries that they have no more room to maneuver. And so in that framework or under these conditions, that means an erosion of the entire purpose of the non-aligned movement. Of course, my take on this would be, in the present situation, when we do not have a fair multipolar and power sharing, and we do not have real fair multilateral mechanisms within the United Nations, for one simple reason, because there is no global power balance. In that situation, the non-aligned movement's commitment to the aims and principles of the United Nations Charter, because all of this is written into the founding document of the non-aligned movement, has particular importance, and a kind of a renewal of the United Nations organization could come from the non-aligned movement, where these UN principles are still at least appreciated or are still taken seriously, while in the United Nations, also because of the power structure, because of the veto of the great powers, and in this case, of course, the veto of the United States counts the most. The United States has made it impossible, for instance, for Palestine to be accepted as a member state of the United Nations. In the non-aligned movement, there is no power that can veto the implementation of any of the principles. So I think this could have a kind of, it could contribute if the leaders of the NAM countries are courageous enough. The movement could contribute to a renewal of the United Nations organization in a time of crisis and also in a time of paralysis.
Okay, thank you.
May I add something?
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to add just a few moments. I would agree with Professor Köchler regarding the importance of non-aligned movement at this particular moment of dynamism of global scene and new Cold War between China and USA that actually put enormous pressure on smaller countries like in ASEAN member states or even in Europe or in Africa. There is a competition over, of course, natural resources, and that's part of the powering position, major power struggle. But I wanted to to remind you about the fact, obviously not that well known in Europe, that Republic of Serbia is also declared neutrality. Which is also particularly difficult to defend, being under pressure for all different big powers that project their power in this part of Europe. And regarding the one of the top breaches of Austrian neutrality that Professor Köchler mentioned, that was in 1999 when there was a NATO invasion of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. At that time, because that euphemism is very often used like a Kosovo war, but actually the whole territory of the country was bombed, especially civilian spots, and that is why there were far more civilian casualties than military targets hit. So these are the points that I just wanted to add, but saying that Serbian neutrality is for sure on the path of former Yugoslavia non-alignment position, because somehow for a small country surrounded and oppressed by different conflicting interests of great powers, neutrality somehow proves not easy to perform, but proves to be maybe the most convenient option for survival. Thank you.
Thank you, Dragana. Allora, a short question by Paolo Motta and then Professor Marius. Paolo Motta.
Yes, I have no video, but just the voice. I don't know why. No, my question is that I am agreeing totally with what Professor Köchler was saying about the big role that the NAM countries can have for renovation if they have the courage within the United Nations organization. But well, if they didn't do it, nothing till now, I don't know if they will succeed in this moment. And then my question is how the smaller NAM countries are posing themselves about the exactly policy of the Chinese, that, well, they're not anymore a NAM non-aligned country, but they are making strong pressures, financial, economical, maybe also military, with the smaller countries, especially in Africa and in other countries of Southeast Asia. Then how is the position of the NAM movement in view of the Chinese expansion policies?
Thank you. Now, Professor Marius, then a short recall to Professor Sacco and Köchler. Professor Marius.
I am having a problem with my connection, and I'm moving about the area, but I hear you now. Would somebody like to ask me a question?
Oh, the question was how the NAM countries can overcome the scandal of divided Cyprus, how they cooperate to reduce the tension in Mediterranean area for around Cyprus, because oil and gas was found there. And more generally, what is in the Mediterranean, NAM countries in the Mediterranean?
Well, I think the point that Professor Hans made about the ability of NAM to influence matters in a not bipolar world and in a not multipolar world is very valid. We know that the NAM movement does exist. We know it functions in the United Nations in various areas, but I don't know how the NAM movement can do anything substantial in the case like Cyprus, because things have radically changed in the aftermath of the Cold War. However, a small country like Cyprus very much depends on solidarity and support in terms of principles of the United Nations, which are the fundamental principles of respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. And in that sense, the aggressive attitude of Turkey cannot complete what it started to do in 1974, namely to destroy the legitimacy of the Cypriot state. As I mentioned, Cyprus is divided, it's truncated by force, but it retains its status as an independent state. That cannot change. And part of the reason it cannot be changed is because, in spite of the weakness of the non-Western world in changing matters that have been imposed by force, they do retain what I call the high moral ground, and I think Cyprus retains that. In that sense, Cyprus has some sort of protection which is supported by the existing non-aligned movement. Now, as you have mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the situation now around Cyprus is extremely complicated, and I think it has to do with the toleration that the West has been showing towards Turkey. We see it not only with regards to what's happening in Cyprus, but we see it with regards to what's happening in Syria. It's my contention, for example, that the war in Syria and the refugee problem in Syria would have ended a long time ago had the actions of Turkey not being tolerated within Syria. Let's not forget Syria is an independent country. Yes, there is a war there, but it should have ended a long time ago had it not been for the acceptance, especially by not only the United States, I must say, a number of European countries as well, tolerating the, you cannot call it any other way, the aggressive behavior on Turkey. Now, there is, probably some of you may know that there is an upcoming meeting scheduled at the end of February, beginning of March, some say even towards the middle of March, a meeting between Greece, Turkey, the United Kingdom. We are supposed to be the guarantor powers of Cyprus. And the irony is that each one of these guarantor powers aggressed against Cyprus. The Greeks aggressed with the coup. The British had obligations. At any rate, so the meeting is coming up, but I am very doubtful that we'll have any results. Now, let me just also say something about the corruption. You are very correct about that. This is totally unacceptable. The people here are revolting against the policies of the present government in basically selling European passports for money. That's something totally unacceptable. And elections are coming up in May, and I think the government will pay a very big price for this kind of behavior. Totally unacceptable.
Thank you, Professor Marios. Allora, very shortly, Professor Sacco and Professor Hans, about the question of China, the relation NAM and China, and Kudori wanted to say something, another short question. Kudori, Darvis.
Yes. You want me to say?
You've written.
Yes, I wrote that. What do you think of the demand of the dissolution of NATO? NATO and NAM are the survival of Cold War. Do they have the same legitimacy to continue to exist? That's my question.
Okay, thank you. Allora, Professor Sacco and Professor Köchler.
Oh, okay. About NATO, the thing is very simple. Of course, NATO had lost all meaning after the end of the Cold War, and as is widely known, the slogan that appeared in NATO environment and after the collapse of the Soviet Union was out of area or out of business. That NATO had to go and do some war somewhere else because in Europe there was no need for NATO any longer. The problem is that NATO is a very powerful structure, not only in many countries, but a very powerful structure inside the US. There is a NATO is a fantastic consumer of arms produced by the American arms industry. And when a new country is added to NATO, this country is obliged to change all its armaments to be compatible with that of NATO. So basically, and also there is another thing, if in America there are 17 secret services, 17 different secret services. NATO is the one who is in touch, in very strict collaboration, traditionally, with that part of the secret services that specialize in Russia and Eastern Europe. Now, also these people risk going out of business because if China becomes the enemy, lots of specialists of Russia have to be fired and replaced with specialists of China. Okay, the problem is that NATO is part of the so-called structures party, the party of structures inside of existing structures inside the US. And there's a prolongation in all NATO countries, okay, and in the armament industry. So it was the point was that they had to find to go out of area, out of Europe, and indeed we have Italian soldiers under NATO flag in Afghanistan, which is very difficult to be placed into the North Atlantic. It takes a geographical effort to put Afghanistan into North Atlantic. Italy is not North Atlantic, but Afghanistan even less. Okay.
I think we just skipped from our main part. I don't know how much time do we have for this session left.
Well, this.
I can say one more thing.
After lunch break, we start at 2 o'clock. So it's up to you what time you want to finish this session. But the next after lunch is 2 o'clock.
Let's finish with this question and then
I say something?
the session.
I can finish very briefly. So China now becomes a rival of the US. It's a strange idea because it is true that the US is a very composite country that only unites when it is under menace. Okay, but China is not the same characteristic as Russia. Russia had something, so the Soviet Union had something that made it unacceptable to the American public opinion. It was against private property. China is not against private property. You can always find an agreement between specific American interests and specific Chinese interests, okay? So China doesn't really qualify as a mortal enemy to the US system. But China has a problem, and this last thing I will say, has a problem of being a country with no access to the sea, to the open sea, because you might know that there are big harbors, Shanghai and Hong Kong, but in front of China, there are 11 something islands that belong to Indonesia and 8,000 and 400 islands that belong to the Philippines. There are only 3 passages from China to get into the open sea: Malacca, the Sunda Strait, and Lombok. And Lombok and Sunda are in Indonesian waters, and Malacca is very dangerous between 2 Muslim countries. So the only way for China to have access to the Indian Ocean is through Burma, through Myanmar. And where you really see that there is a reason of conflicts is in Myanmar. And the fact that Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi, after being given the Nobel Prize and all these acknowledgements from the West, suddenly had become an enemy because she, once in power, she decided she wanted to be equidistant, to be neutral between China and the US. And this is the source of all the present troubles of Burma. So what happens is that a new problem of neutralism is appearing in Southeast Asia, and mainly the main focus is Burma. To make very short, very short.
Yeah, Professor Hans.
Yeah, I will answer in the sequence of the questions asked according to what I see on the chat board. First one was about China. If I may just read, how are the NAM countries positioned with the Chinese? And then what is added is expansion policy and influence on smaller countries. In my assessment, the world may be now going into the direction of a new kind of bipolarity, this time between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And that development seems to continue now also under the new administration of President Biden. And this may be a kind of power struggle and struggle for influence that can become pervasive in all regions of the globe. And what is important for a movement like NAM and also for its member states individually is not to be drawn into that conflict and to have learned, so to speak, the lessons of the first Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Of course, the situation now is even much more complicated because of the COVID pandemic, and it is understandable that many countries now rely on the help from where they can get it. Europe seems to be, and also the United States doesn't seem to be very positive about international solidarity. China so far has played a constructive role in providing equipment and even vaccinations to quite a big number of countries in the non-aligned world, but still the overall conflict and power competition between these two superpowers, US and China, should be taken into consideration, and cooperation in the field in technical fields should be distinguished from cooperation in strictly political or military fields. But let's just recall, China has played, how to speak, a kind of modest role, not as a member of the movement, but as an observer country. It did support the aims of the movement in the sense of implementing the goals and principles of the United Nations Charter, and it still continues to support a policy of multilateralism. That is the official doctrine. It's not a hegemonial policy as the one defined by President Trump or enforced by President Trump for 4 years, but China has been a steadfast supporter of peaceful coexistence. And that means also peaceful coexistence among different ideological systems. And in that regard, one can say that, at least in terms of principles, there should be no difficulty for the non-aligned movement, but in terms of the actual confrontations over economic and also military issues, see now what happens in the South China Sea, it is of utmost importance for the smaller countries also of the non-movement not to be drawn into that confrontation. Another question was about the European Union states and how they can contribute to NAM in the global raising crisis, as I see. Here, for me, the problem is that the European Union itself is a kind of a power bloc that is, in very important respects of its security policy, interlinked with NATO. Many of the EU member countries, and certainly the leading countries, are also member states of NATO. And such a power bloc, in the sense not only of economic power, but in the sense of military power, that is aligned with one of the major two global players, will have difficulties to relate to the non-aligned movement in a principled sense, or it will be difficult to have any constructive cooperation. And the last question was about NATO. This is the point I always have made, if I may just reply to Professor Kudori.
Well,
it was a kind of dishonesty on the part of the Western world, on the part of the United States, to continue with NATO in the way they did after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, the rationale of NATO in the time of the Cold War was to be a collective defense agreement applicable on the territory of its member states. And when the threat, as it was perceived in the West, had subsided with the disappearance of the Warsaw Pact, there was no more justification to continue with this kind of defense pact. The member states of NATO realized that, and quite quickly, as we may recall, after the end of the Cold War, they convened in Washington and adopted a new doctrine. Now NATO is not anymore a defense, an organization of collective self-defense, but it is a kind of military organization with global outreach. And they coined a new term, which is that term of the out-of-area crisis response operations, or non-Article 5 crisis response operations, as they call it. And they even try to define their role as a kind of enforcer of Security Council resolutions in more than one crisis so far. So this is now a totally different outlook, but in my view, it was a breach of confidence when, after the end of the Cold War, they decided to continue, and they decided to encircle, as we have seen, the Russian Federation with their bases. And so now it is a kind of global military arm of the United States and the other member countries of NATO, and it cannot play any constructive role in terms of peace and coexistence. It would have to abandon this doctrine of non-Article 5 crisis response operations, as they call it. I do not see any justification to act for NATO to act outside the territory of the treaty. That means outside the territory of its member states. But that's what NATO now effectively does in different parts of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Köchler. We are going to finish. Dragana, please conclude, because we have a academic delay, what we say.
Yes, yes. I would like very much to thank Professor Ricceri for co-chairing, basically chairing this session. I would like to deeply express our gratitude to all the participants whose speeches and discussion contributed a lot for opening, presenting, deepening our understanding of different aspects of the topics that we've been over today. And I'm positive that all the participants learned a lot. Myself, of course, I did. And also I met some wonderful people. I would like to cooperate in the future too. This is also one of the things that such conferences offer to all of us. I wish you all to stay safe and healthy and continue participation in our conference. And again, I would like to thank Professor Hudori, whose enormous work and dedication actually made all this possible to happen today. Thank you very much. Have a nice day or good night. All the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So you may leave your